Australia rules football was pretty big business in Melbourne, the capital city of Victoria in Australia's southeast. In fact, some might argue that it's the official religion of the entire state, where for just short of 100 years, the Victorian Football League, now known as the Australian Football League after a name change in 1990, ruled as the number one form of entertainment during the winter months. Back then, men were considered to be real men. Victorian football was a hard and tough environment that sorted out the blokes from the boys. It was also a very tribal and very territorial sport based on loyalties to semi-professional clubs situated in suburban areas of the city. Working-class Collingwood and somewhat more posh Carlton were the biggest of rivals, whilst also being two of the sport's most powerful entities for over a century. And to play even one game for either meant you had to be a bloody good footballer. I've had a small handful of relatives play for each at various times, as well as a couple more who represented the Footscray Club, a real blue-collar mob from Melbourne's rough-and-tumble western suburbs. While there have been a number of others, as many as 29, who have pulled on the jumpers for various VFL teams and obviously now the AFL, as it's known. In this episode, I'm going to focus on one Magpie legend, a highly skilled wingman who managed a single senior game for the Blues, and two Bulldogs with interesting tales to tell. So to kick things off, we're going to start with Percy Edward Rowe, who's an ancestor of my two youngest children. He was born in the northwestern Victorian town of St Arnaud way back in 1889. Half a century earlier, St Arnaud was one of many towns that sprung up during the Great Gold Rush and was a bustling centre for a period until the big finds of gold dried up. We don't know a great deal about Rowe's childhood and early life, which family historians on my children's maternal side tell me was sort of unremarkable and without incident, other than an unbelievable ability to try his hand at any sport and be bloody good at it. Sadly, he only managed to live until 27, a life cut short by the ravages of war. Initially, football was his big love, plying his trade at the South Bendigo club for some time. However, he also dabbled in cricket like most Aussie men of the time, and notably was more than handy in the boxing ring. And it was boxing where he made his name, in more ways than one, adopting the very Irish-sounding stage name of Paddy Rowan. His family roots extended back to Cornwall in England. However, the persona of a mad Irishman certainly had a better ring to it than the son of a Cornish miner. From here on in, I'll refer to him by this name as it is the one that he was best known as. So the 5'10", 172-pound Rowan boxed as an amateur and won the Victorian Championship as a lightweight. So interestingly, for those who don't really know much about boxing, in the modern era, he would be classed as a light heavyweight. So I go to guess that at his height and weight, he would have been a fairly imposing sight to his opponents. And he's a pretty big guy in that sort of era as well. In 1910, he turned professional and was still indulging in pugilistic activities when World War I rolled around 4 years later. Now, as an extremely promising country footballer, Paddy was recruited by Collingwood for the 1911 season. So he was starting to earn money from both football and boxing at the same time, which would have definitely been handy, even though neither paid the sort of cash on offer 110 years later, where guys probably of his ilk would be getting up around the $800,000 to $1 million mark a season. Now, this is also where his assumed name really took off, as the rules of football back then didn't allow for him to move from South Bendigo to Collingwood as easily as it's done today. There's no draft or anything like that. So the Magpies seized on the Paddy Rowan persona and registered him under that name to get around the situation, which obviously you couldn't do in today's day and age, but back then paper trails were a little more difficult to follow. Coincidentally, another Percy Rowe, who is believed to be unrelated, played 96 games for Collingwood after the Great War. And Rowan's son, also named Percy, played a few games for the reserves team later on as well. And the older Percy Rowe, who played the 96 games, also went on to coach Richmond and I believe Fitzroy. So Paddy made his debut for Collingwood in round 5 of 1911 as the 176th player in the club's history and went on to play a total of 82 matches in the black and white, booting 28 goals. His final game was played in the 1915 grand final before shipping out with the Army. And whilst 82 games and 28 goals doesn't seem like a big deal to anyone who follows the game now, they play a lot more games per season, and obviously the guys are a lot fitter and they don't have to work outside of football as well, so they can keep their bodies in shape for a lot longer. The VFL back then, though, was an almost amateur competition with very small player payments, and not many great players had long careers as they could earn more money working regular jobs or playing footy in the bush. It was what Rowan packed into those 82 games that made him so successful and remarkable. He unfortunately didn't taste the ultimate, having played in 2 losing grand finals. Something Collingwood was once known for was losing a lot of grand finals. I think it's up around the 28 to 29 mark, as opposed to 16 victories. 16 victories is still bloody impressive too. So former teammate Dan Minogue said of Rowan, he was one of the outstanding players of his time, and I feel sure had he had been spared to return from the war, he would have gone down in football as one of the game's greatest exponents. There was no phase of it in which he did not excel. He possessed the determination and courage of 2 men. That's pretty strong words indeed. On the morning of the 1915 grand final, he'd participated in a 10-mile march with the Army in full kit, yet he still turned up for the game and had a decent crack, lining up on Carlton's Ted Brown, who'd played in the Blues premiership team a year earlier and was to collect his second win that day as his team won by 27 points. During his time as a VFL footballer, Rowan struck up an unbreakable friendship with teammate Doc Sennan, essentially being joined at the hip as they worked together and also played cricket side by side, as well as football, obviously. Doc introduced Paddy to Louise Newby, which led to Paddy and Louise getting married shortly after. Doc was the best man on the big day as well. And the 2 close mates then headed off to war together, with Rowan unfortunately dying from wounds received during the Battle of the Somme in December 1916. Doc managed to return home and fulfilled a promise to look after Louise, with the 2 eventually marrying and having a further 2 children of their own, whilst raising young Percy as Doc's son at the same time as maintaining Paddy's legacy. Yeah, so that's a pretty good story, and I guess diehard Collingwood people, especially the older ones, would definitely know a lot more about Paddy Rowan and what sort of a player he was. But yeah, he must have been something pretty special. When you hear the way people do talk about him, he's very highly revered. Now, a guy who's not as well known in football terms, he's known for, I guess, another pursuit, which I'll get to, is Lionel Vivian Ollington. He's my dad's paternal cousin. Now, we share a 2-time great-grandfather, John Magpie, who emigrated to Australia from Scotland and ultimately settled in northwestern Tasmania. John's daughter, Era, married Albert Ollington, who was from a notable family in the Smithton district, which is probably an hour or so west of Burnie, which is probably the biggest town nearby to there. Erif and Albert had a controversial end to their marriage, which is a story for another time. And as a result, she at some point found herself living in Melbourne with her children before she moved north to Queensland later on, where she remarried. But it was through the connection to Melbourne that Lionel's father, Albert Jr., ended up being in Victoria as well. And yeah, so Lionel found himself in an area formerly known as Montague, which is part of modern-day South Melbourne, bordered by Ferris Street to Boundary Road, and from City Road to the railway line, where a railway station was established in 1883. And for those who live in Melbourne now and have been to the South Melbourne area, or even to the Port Melbourne area on public transport. That station is now known as stop number 126 on the 109 Port Melbourne tram line. The area had its own kindergarten, school, church, shops, pubs, police station, and even a football team, the Montague Rovers, which is where Lionel, who became better known as Nappy, was recruited from by the Footscray Bulldogs. Now, I don't know a lot about where the Nappy nickname comes from. There's a few different stories. I'm not going to pick one just in case that's the wrong one. But you jump on the internet, there's a couple of different versions that if you search hard enough. So Montague was a working class area, a bit rough and tumble, like the western suburbs of Melbourne, as I'd already mentioned, where many of the Footscray Bulldogs' greatest players were drawn from, and no doubt Nappy would have fitted right in that area. And at 173 centimetres, about 5'6", 5'7", and 64 kilos, I don't know what that is in pounds, but not a lot. He wasn't really a large man, even by the standards of the time he played in during the 1950s. He was known to be a hard and tough man, though, and in later life would stand up to many a colourful underworld figure who tried to stand over him. As a VFL footballer, his career was short and not entirely mind-blowing. However, he was involved in some memorable moments for the Bulldogs. Prior to that, he made his league debut in round 14 of 1953 against Hawthorn at the Glenferrie Oval, wearing the number 8 jumper. So he must have been reasonably highly rated by the club and as a player to have such a low number on his back. So I do wonder why he only managed 5 senior games ultimately. On debut, he booted 2 goals but failed to add any more to his tally over the following 2 weeks and subsequently missed the final couple of regular season games. He did, however, return for the finals campaign, which was great. Footscray finished 3rd on the ladder that year with 13 wins and 5 losses, only 2 wins behind Geelong, who, despite topping the table, ended up losing the grand final a few weeks later. Now, all 3 of Nappy's games to that point were wins to the Bulldogs, but then it was on to the final series, the club's 6th campaign in 16 years. After crossing over to the VFL from the Victorian Football Association in 1925, successes were few and far between for Footscray. And by the time Nappy was in the senior team, they'd already endured 5 finals losses from 5 attempts, before finally winning their first ever VFL final in 1953 against Essendon by 8 points. There is some wonderful film footage available on the National Archives of Australia website of that 1953 semi-final between Footscray and Essendon, mainly of the great John Coleman, who played for Essendon. However, right at the very end, there's a passage of play where Nappy swoops on the ball and bursts out of a pack to swing around and kick long towards goal. He did score a goal that day, although I have no way actually of knowing if that kick ended up being the goal or not. I'm just going to say it was, because it was a pretty good passage of play from the little bit you see, and it's right at the end of the video. Either way, Nappy did enough to retain his place for the preliminary final against Geelong a week later, which Footscray would unfortunately go on to lose by 26 points. That was it for him, though, and he never played senior level football for the Bulldogs again, missing out on their first premiership win a year later. And yeah, he unfortunately passed away 2 years before the club won its only other grand final in 2016. So life after football was very interesting and somewhat colourful for Nappy as he entered into a vastly different world. Whilst raising his children, Sharman, Stephen, Robert and Ben, he also indulged in the world of illegal tour. For those unaware or outside of Australia who probably haven't heard of tour before, it's a game originally played by Aussie soldiers during the First World War, using 2 coins that are flipped in the air and bets are taken on the result once they land, kind of similar to that dice game Americans play, which I have no idea what the name is. I don't really care, to be honest. So at some point in Australian history, the game was outlawed, except on Anzac Day, and illegal dens popped up all over the country. So Nappy's 2-up ring was by far the most well-known and popular, attracting many famous and infamous figures from both sides of the law and all levels of society. A number of wannabe gangsters tried to muscle him out of the business throughout his career that lasted from sometime in the 1960s until around 1990. But he was always up to the task of defending his turf. And as age caught up with him, though, he eventually did sell his two-up ring to underworld figure Mick Gatto, who himself has a pretty big tale to tell, but that's not for me to go into. That's my only family connection to Mick Gatto is through Nappy. So that's someone else's story. In popular culture, Nappy's two-up gets the odd mentions in a few television shows, with the most notable being in Underbelly, A Tale of Two Cities, which came out maybe around the 2009 mark, I'm going to say. And it's just a bit of a mention. And Mick Gatto has a couple of sort of cameos in that, and he's quite prominent in the original Underbelly as well. Many police members attended Nappy's funeral, and one in particular, Detective Sergeant Bob Hayward, spoke at the service saying even the gaming squad members who were duty-bound to raid Nappy's two-up games didn't think he was doing anything much wrong. Like most Australians, they probably thought two-up, being the fairest game of all, was fair cop, having been played by the diggers back in the days. And Nappy also ran legal two-up at Flemington Racecourse on Anzac Day from 1991 to 1997 after gaining support from then RSL head Bruce Ruxton. Raised more than $1 million just in the first year alone, which I believe went to charity. Don't quote me on that. And his sons Robert and Stephen mounted a campaign to bring it back after 1997. And eventually in 2018, they were given approval. And another of my relatives to represent the Footscray Club was James Joseph Gutterson, known to all as Jimmy. And Jimmy is a maternal cousin to my father. Jimmy's time at the club came a decade after Nappy's, although they both had some crossover teammates, including the great Mr. Football, Ted Whitten, who by Jimmy's period in the tricolour jumper was the captain and coach, and by then recognised as one of the greatest footballers of all time up to that point as well, possibly still. Jimmy's father, also called James, was a prisoner of war in a Japanese camp during World War II, and grandfather Claude lost his life in service on the Western Front. So life in this branch of the family had its tragedies, and I can never find the right words to thank them for their sacrifices, particularly at the time of recording. Anzac Day is just a week away. A solidly built young man in his day at 6 foot and 90 kilograms, Jimmy initially began his VFL journey at under 19 level with Collingwood, who were a powerful club in the mid to late 1950s. He also had a stint at North Melbourne, another club that had joined the expanded league in 1925 alongside Footscray and Hawthorn. He eventually landed at the Bulldogs and made his senior debut in 1961 in front of 18,000 spectators at Cardinia Park in Geelong. Must have been a windy day as Footscray kicked 4 goals and a whopping 14 behinds on the way to losing by 58 points against the Cats. Further games against Hawthorn, Fitzroy, St Kilda and Essendon followed before he missed the final 7 senior matches of the year. He played in wins against Hawthorn, who were that season's premier, and Essendon, unfortunately losing to Fitzroy and St Kilda. Footscray scraped into the finals that year, holding out a fast-finishing Fitzroy, and duly defeated St Kilda in the first semi-final. A week later, they denied Melbourne victory and a chance to play in their 8th grand final in a row to line up against Hawthorn on the big day. Now, Jimmy didn't make Footscray's team for the big decider, although I'm sure he would have taken great pride in watching his mates play their hearts out. Unfortunately, they went down to the Hawks by 43 points in front of an enormous crowd of 107,000. And now I'm going to put that into perspective. I went to the AFL Grand Final last year, 2023. There was 100,024 people in attendance, and the MCG is bigger, has bigger grandstands, more seating, and it felt like we were packed in like sardines. So you can imagine what 107,000 would have felt like back then, with less, smaller grandstands, less seating, people just crammed in everywhere like you wouldn't believe. It would have been an amazing atmosphere, but probably stinking hot and a bit stuffy, but that's the way it was back then before health and safety regulations were what they are now. Jimmy added a further 2 senior games to his eventual tally of 7 in 1962, both of which were wins against Richmond and Collingwood, two powerhouses of the league. And whilst he didn't play any more games in the main team, he had a stellar year at reserves level, which for those in America, I guess it's kind of like the minor leagues. The reserves are a feeder team to the main team. And Jimmy won the Gardner Medal as fairest and best player in the competition that year. And Footscray's reserves also won the premiership, with Jimmy starring on the day as he had all season, of course. A twist on the Gardner Medal story too is that in those days you could accept either a medal or a voucher from whoever was the sponsor for that given year. As it turned out, that year it was a furniture store, and Jimmy decided to accept a coffee table as he was getting married and felt it would be of greater use. Sometime in the early 2000s, Scott Palmer, who had once upon a time been the Herald Sun newspaper's chief football writer, wrote a column about Jimmy's decision and implored the AFL, as it became known, to mint him a replacement medal for prosperity's sake. Jimmy's son Michael explained to me a couple of years ago that with the help of former Bulldogs club president Peter Gordon and several others, the family was able to receive a medal, which they still have to this day. I'm not sure who has it in their possession, but hey, don't ever let go of it, because it's amazing that it was eventually handed out. After finishing up at Footscray, Jimmy spent some time at VFA club Moorabbin, winning a premiership in 1963, defeating Sandringham. Back then, there was better money playing association football than there was in the VFL. And he was also selected to play in a representative team against the Tasmanian state side. Michael explained to me that Jim's opponent in that game was the great Peter Hudson, who would go on to bigger and better things at Hawthorn years later. On this occasion, though, in Michael's words, he had his ass kicked and got sent to the bench. And back then, if you got dragged off the ground, you generally didn't come back on. So we'll chalk that one up as a big win to Jimmy. So good on you, Jimmy. Well done, mate. And incidentally, Moorabbin were then kicked out of the competition, and Jimmy headed north to Wagga Wagga in New South Wales, where he was employed as the captain coach of Turvey Park while his wife Rose worked as a nurse at the Wagga Base Hospital. One of Jim's Footscray teammates, Graham Ion, would later coach the club as well. And there's a story that Carlton legend John Nichols was the original choice to coach the club. However, he was enticed to stay with the Blues for a big pay rise, and Jimmy was the next cab off the rank. I think they made the right choice. Jimmy's obviously pretty good at what he did. And Jimmy finished up his playing days a couple of years later after that at Chelsea in the southern coastal suburbs of Melbourne after a brief stint at Paran. And I'm not too sure how many games he played at Paran, but he definitely took the field for Chelsea and sadly had a career-ending knee injury. Michael tells how his kneecap was dislocated so badly it was at the back of his knee, and said to me, then the doctor just hit his kneecap back into position, gave him a set of crutches and said, on your way, son. Back in those days, if you injured your knee, it was very rare to come back without the amazing technology that's available in more modern times. Jimmy passed away in 2008 on the Mornington Peninsula, and I've read some of the wonderful tributes left by family and friends in the Herald Sun newspaper, and every time his name is mentioned amongst relatives, even to this day, you can feel his glow straight away. He was clearly a great man, loved by all. So the following is being repeated here by myself verbatim from an article on the Carlton Football Club website, carltonfc.com.au. And the article was written by Tony DiBolfo, an esteemed journalist and I guess renowned fan of the Carlton Football Club. And I was going to try and rewrite the information so that it was in my own words, but I don't think I could have done it the justice that Tony did. And the article was released on the 21st of August 2020 after the passing of maternal first cousin Daryl Gutterson. And it goes as follows. As a Carlton senior footballer, he ran out but once wearing the famous button-up dark navy blue Guernsey with the number 47 on the back. It happened almost 50 years ago, but Daryl Gutterson always deemed it an honour to wear that jumper. Now, in the wake of Daryl's untimely passing at the age of 67, the item carries even greater poignancy for the loved ones he leaves behind. Zoned to Carlton, but only just, as the dividing line with Fitzroy was across the road from his family's home in Derrick Street, Lawler, Darryl, then an impressionable 16-year-old, joined fellow Lawler player Ian Cartwright in the move to Princes Park in 1969 in what was a magnificent epoch in Carlton history. A second cousin of the 7-game Footscray player and 1962 Gardner medalist Jim Gutterson, Darryl, or Dizzy as Brent Croswell dubbed him for his breathtaking turn of speed, first turned out for the Bill Hoogan coached under-19s. He progressed through the reserves, initially under the watch of the late Keith McKenzie, and in 1971 finally earned his 1-0 call-up, ironically against the Fitzroy Lions in the round 10 match at Princes Park. Having blown out the candles on his 18th birthday cake just 27 days earlier, Darryl featured in another first when he followed Big Nick, that's John Nichols, who I mentioned earlier, down the race in that maiden senior appearance. For this was also the game in which Carlton coach Ron Barassi and Fitzroy coach Graham Donaldson, Darryl's reserve grade coach at Carlton the previous year, famously agreed to trial the 50-yard centre square, within which only 4 players from each team were permitted to frequent at the centre bounce. Named 20th man on the bench alongside John Warden, who was wearing the number 46, the budding wingman with a thumping left foot got the call up early in his solitary senior appearance and stood both David Rhodes and Trevor McGregor, 8 weeks after McGregor took out the 71 Stall Gift, the last league footballer to win the coveted foot race. Darryl's oldest son, Brent, so named after Croswell, his longtime friend, said that a lack of application in his tender years probably went against his father. Quote, after making his senior debut against Fitzroy in 71, Dad played the rest of that year in the reserves, and he played on in the twos until the end of 73, Brent said. Although Barras liked Dad as a footballer, Dad always told me that with the likes of Gary Crane, Ian Robertson and Brian Quirk going around, it was a case of right place, wrong time for him. And being a young guy, Dad probably thought natural talent would get him through, and in the end, a run-in with Barras didn't help. So that run-in, which Brent referred to, took place on another occasion when Darryl was kicking the dew off the grass. A former teammate, the 1968 Premiership player Ian Collins, recalled the incident. Darryl was quite a clever wing half forward, although he wasn't very big and was quite light. Anyway, he was playing in the reserves this particular day, and at halftime, while we were stripping for the senior match, he walked into the room, Collins said. Barassi lined Darryl up and told him he was shirking the issue. Barras grabbed him by the throat and tried to put him into one of the lockers. The locker was about half the size of Darryl, but Barras was trying to force him headfirst into it. Little did Barassi realise that Darryl, a southpaw, was more than a handy amateur welterweight, and retribution came swiftly, courtesy of a left hook across the chops, which split the coach's lip and drew blood in the process. Not surprisingly, Darryl had 21 and with 68 reserve grade matches and the one solitary senior appearance to his name, parted company with the club he loved. He sought a clearance to Fitzroy, but the Blues played hardball, and so he crossed to VFA outfit Brunswick. By the age of 28, after having represented Watsonia in the Diamond Valley Football League, Darryl opted to give the game away, his commitment to work as a sales rep for a fittings and bearings business taking precedence. So Darryl also played alongside my uncle Stephen at Lawler around sort of the time he was back in the Diamond Valley Football League as well. Absolutely starring. The two of them were stars, Darryl wing half forward and Stephen down in the back line as a key defender. And I've got some copies of some newspaper articles that I got from one of my aunties, and yeah, they have some really lots of mentions of the two, particularly Darryl, and some really kind words as well. So back to Brent, and he said, though he loved Carlton, Dad always thought that if he lived on the other side of Derrick Street, he might have been a 100-game Fitzroy player, given the players he was competing against at Princes Park in that era. And I'll just add to that too, like Fitzroy in the 70s probably weren't really that good. And me being a Fitzroy supporter breaks my heart to say that, but that's a fact. And I'm sure Darryl would have walked straight into that team immediately and probably played more than 100 games, in my opinion. But yeah, getting back to the article, Daryl also kept a soft spot for Princess Park and his people despite that run-in with Barassi. He was a regular at Spirit of Carlton functions and only took great delight recently in seeing Callum Moore getting around in the old number 47. And as Brent said, Dad used to say to me, I only played one game, but I'd tell him, Dad, you played in exalted company, the company of absolute legends of the VFL, AFL, and I'd have given anything to have run out once at a senior game wearing a Carlton jersey. And Brent himself was a Carlton reserve grade player who trained with the likes of Craig Bradley, Brendan Favola, Anthony Koutafidis, another Lawler boy as well, and Brett Ratton through 2002, and took goal kicking honours with 30 from a half-forward flank. And he played in a TAC Cup under-18s grand final for the Northern Knights as well. And I recall listening to that on the radio. Collingwood coach of the time, I think it was Mick Malthouse, was on special comments or was being interviewed during the game. I can't exactly recall, and actually said some pretty kind words about Brent. And Mick Malthouse is one of the most well-respected and successful coaches of my lifetime, that's for sure. Back to Brent, and he said, Dad played in a magnificent era at Carlton with Crane, Croswell, Gallagher, Jackson, Jezelenko, Mackay, Nichols, Robertson and Walls, and I think that's David Swan Mackay, not Andrew Mackay, who played in my era. They're all famous names that are still talked about now. And as a person, Dad was a pure gentleman. He wanted to know everyone's stories. And when I was playing, he used to follow me down to the games, and we'd talk footy because footy brought him so much joy. The four-time Carlton Premiership player, David Mackay, so yeah, that's who that was. As with Collins and other of Darryl's old teammates, remembered the one-game wingman as a good player who, like so many of his time, found it difficult to break into the ultra-successful side that Carlton had. But that one game meant so much to Daryl. He was proud of his association with Carlton, and he was loved and respected by his former teammates, Mackay said. He was a terrific fellow too. Every time you saw him at a past players function, which was often, his face lit up. He had a rough look about him, but underneath beat a heart of absolute gold. Daryl died in the intensive care unit of Heidelberg's Austin Hospital on Thursday, August 13, after suffering a cardiac arrest 5 days previous. He is survived by his wife, Robin, who is a niece of Carlton's first Brownlow medalist, Bert Deacon, a very famous name in Carlton circles, and sons Brent and Reese, daughter Emily, and their respective spouses and 6 grandchildren. So, yeah, that's a story of just 4 of the around about 29 or 30 relatives of mine who, or in my case, relatives of my children on their maternal side, who have made a mark on the VFL competition. There's a small handful currently playing now in the AFL competition. There's been a couple over the years who played for the club I support, the Fitzroy Maroons back then. They went on to become the Gorillas and then the Lions, and ultimately moved up to Brisbane to become the Brisbane Lions, who, after merging with the Brisbane Bears, who another 2 of my relatives, one maternal, one paternal, played for. So a couple of family connections to the club I support as well, which, yeah, I will come back with another episode soon with some of the more modern players, and also a young female relative of mine on my mum's side who has just been drafted by the West Coast Eagles in the AFL women's competition, which is now about to kick into its 9th season. And that's a wonderful thing to have as well for football and just for women as sport as well. And this is a little bit of a cliche, but I do have a daughter who plays football, and for her to have a couple of female relatives playing football as well, because we have another one playing at the Adelaide Crows, who's one of the more well-known players who we will get into in another episode and hopefully get her on for an interview. That's great role models for my daughter as well. So I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I'll have another one coming up soon, which actually does touch on some of the more impactful women in my family throughout the generations and some of their stories, because I do really, truly believe that the women have just as great a story to tell as the men, even though history doesn't often go down that road. I definitely want to. So, yep, just keep watching on the Facebook page and the YouTube channel, and hopefully I'll have another one out in the next month or so for you to enjoy and listen to as well. So thank you for listening, and we'll see you soon.